The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as Nia Mitchell stood before Judge Daniel Graves. Her heart beat steadily, but her mind was racing, replaying every detail of the moment that had brought her here. It had all started with an administrative error, a missed submission for a compliance report linked to her project on digital accessibility. A small slip-up, one that could easily be corrected with a phone call or an email, but instead, it had led to a courtroom summons. Nia wasn't unfamiliar with bureaucracy. In her years of working in technology and social justice, she'd encountered her fair share of frustrating red tape. But today, it felt different. The judge, with his stoic expression and unwavering authority, seemed to dismiss her at first glance. Her work, her passion, the countless hours spent ensuring that people in underserved communities could access the internet, none of that seemed to matter here. All that mattered was this minor infraction in the eyes of the law. Judge Graves adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice sharp, "you're here today because your company failed to submit the required compliance report by the deadline. I assume this wasn't intentional, but there's a process to follow. The law is clear." He glanced down at his papers, barely looking at her. Nia straightened her posture. Her voice was steady but firm, tempered by both professionalism and a growing sense of frustration. "Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. The report was submitted late due to a technical glitch in the system, and while I acknowledge the delay, it was not intentional. My team and I have been working tirelessly to ensure that rural and underserved communities have access to the internet. This is a matter of accessibility, not negligence." The judge didn't look up. The law doesn't distinguish between intention and oversight. The fine is standard procedure. He paused, almost as if reading from a script, then added, "You will be fined $5,000 for noncompliance." Nia's chest tightened. She had anticipated a fine, but hearing it spoken out loud was another matter. $5,000. It was a significant amount of money, but it wasn't just the cost that bothered her. It was the principle. She was being penalized for working in a space that no one seemed to fully understand. Her efforts to bridge the digital divide, to create equal access to information, were being reduced to a mere technicality. "Your Honor," Nia began again, her voice softer but no less resolute, "I'm trying to change the way our country thinks about technology and access. I'm working to ensure that every person, regardless of their background, has equal access to information. A fine like this, for something as small as a missed report, feels like a setback in that mission." Judge Graves looked up for the first time, meeting her gaze. His expression softened for a brief moment, but he didn't change his decision. "I understand your passion, Ms. Mitchell, but the law is the law. You can file an appeal if you choose." Nia nodded, her jaw tightening. She didn't have time to argue further. There was a bigger battle ahead. As she left the courtroom, the fine felt like a weight she'd have to carry. But it also ignited something deeper. She wasn't just fighting for a small victory anymore. She was fighting for something much larger than herself. The courtroom doors swung shut behind Nia with a soft thud, and the weight of the fine seemed to settle in her chest like a heavy stone. She walked down the courthouse steps with a mixture of resolve and frustration. Her team was waiting for her outside, a small group of dedicated professionals who had been by her side since the beginning. They watched her approach, their faces anxious. "You okay?" asked Jamal, her lead engineer, his eyes searching her face. Nia forced a smile. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. "But we have a bigger problem now." Her mind was already racing, running through the next steps, calculating how best to turn this setback into an opportunity. The fine was a distraction, but it was also a moment to show just how deeply broken the system was. The fine wasn't just about money. It was about the lack of understanding for the work they were doing. It was about the fact that in a courtroom full of policy experts, Nia's passion to bring affordable, high-speed internet to marginalized communities had been reduced to a technical violation. "That's not a small thing, Nia." Alicia, her communications director, chimed in. We need to fight this. There's too much at stake. Nia shook her head. Fighting the fine won't solve the bigger issue. It's just a symptom of the problem. What problem? Jamal asked, clearly confused. The system. The way regulations are written. The way they don't consider the real-world impact of the work we're doing. It's all about compliance, not progress. Alicia crossed her arms, nodding in agreement. So what now? Nia took a deep breath, the weight of it all pressing down on her. Now we push harder. We keep going. And we use this to drive the conversation forward. The fine is just a distraction. What matters is our work. We've got to get this project into the right hands. Policymakers, tech companies, anyone who can help us change the rules. The team nodded, sensing the shift in Nia's tone. This wasn't just about correcting a minor mistake. It was about a bigger vision, one that needed to be heard. They could argue the technicalities of the fine later, but for now, they would focus on the mission: revolutionizing federal internet accessibility. The next few days were a whirlwind. Nia and her team doubled down on their efforts, refining the proposal they had been working on for months, a plan that would provide affordable internet access to rural areas, low-income communities, and people with disabilities. It was a monumental task, one that required navigating layers of bureaucratic red tape, outdated policies, and a tech industry often more concerned with profits than accessibility. Nia knew the fine wouldn't be the last hurdle. But with every obstacle, she grew more determined. She wasn't just advocating for better internet access anymore. She was fighting for equality in a digital world that had long left certain communities behind. And in this moment, that fight was just beginning. The days following the courtroom debacle were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and late nights at the office. Nia and her team dove headfirst into refining their project. ConnectAll, a comprehensive plan to expand affordable, high-speed internet access to rural, disabled, and underserved communities. What had begun as a small initiative now felt like a battle for the soul of the nation's digital infrastructure. Nia knew that the consequences of their work could reach far beyond her project's initial scope. But the frustration from the fine still lingered like a shadow over her every step. She couldn't shake the feeling that the system was designed to make people like her, visionaries and disruptors, feel invisible. However, the more she thought about it, the more she realized that ConnectAll wasn't just about connecting people to the internet. It was about giving people a voice, making sure that everyone, regardless of where they lived or how much money they made, could access the vast world of information and opportunity online. As the project gained momentum, Nia's focus sharpened. She knew that to make lasting change, they needed to secure government support. Without it, they'd be limited in how much they could achieve. Nia reached out to various organizations that could help her navigate the labyrinth of federal regulations, advocacy groups, tech companies, and even a few influential policymakers she had met in the past. One of those contacts was Representative Lisa Grant, a progressive lawmaker with a history of pushing for tech reforms. After an initial call, Grant invited Nia to a meeting to discuss the future of internet access in America. "I've read about your work, Nia," Representative Grant said as she shook her hand in a conference room filled with glossy tables and paperwork. "And I'm impressed. But this is a battle in Congress, not just in the tech industry. Changing federal policy to prioritize access like you're suggesting will take time." Nia felt a surge of hope. She wasn't alone in this fight. "I know," she said, "but I'm not asking for a handout. I'm asking for the opportunity to do this the right way, by pushing the conversation forward and helping the government update outdated regulations. It's about creating a space where we aren't just reacting to problems but proactively solving them." Grant smiled. "I agree. Let's figure out how we can make it happen." With this newfound ally, Nia's sense of purpose grew. But the more she moved forward, the more she realized the scale of the challenge before her. There were legal frameworks to navigate, complicated contracts to draft, and hundreds of voices to be heard. But Nia was no stranger to obstacles. The fine, though frustrating, had only intensified her resolve. Soon after, Nia received an invitation to speak at a national tech conference. It was a dream come true, one that could give ConnectAll the kind of visibility it needed to shift the conversation from theory to practice. As she prepared for the speech, Nia couldn't help but think of Judge Graves. What would he say now? Would he even recognize the woman he had so quickly dismissed in that courtroom? The day of the National Tech Conference arrived, and Nia stood backstage, nervously adjusting the collar of her blazer. This was the moment she had been working for, the chance to share ConnectAll with an audience of influential leaders, policymakers, and industry giants. The room buzzed with energy as hundreds of people took their seats, but all Nia could focus on was the weight of the opportunity in front of her. Nia had spent countless hours preparing her presentation, carefully crafting every word, every statistic, every story that illustrated the urgent need for a digital revolution. But this wasn't just about convincing people that internet access was important. It was about shifting the entire framework of how access was perceived, particularly in underserved communities that often fell through the cracks of modern policy. As she walked onto the stage, a hush fell over the room. The lights were blinding, but she could still make out the sea of faces staring up at her. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. "Good afternoon, everyone," Nia began, her voice strong despite the nerves that fluttered in her stomach. "I stand here today not just as a tech entrepreneur, but as someone who believes that the internet is not a privilege, it's a right." She paused for a moment, letting her words settle. The audience was listening. Across the country, millions of Americans, rural families, students with disabilities, and low-income communities are being left behind by an infrastructure that was built without them in mind. My team and I have been working on ConnectAll, a project designed to change that. We want to build a future where access to information, education, and opportunity isn't limited by geography, income, or disability. But to do that, we need your support. We need to change the way we think about digital accessibility. As Nia spoke, she felt a surge of confidence. This was her purpose, and she could see the impact her words were having. The room was no longer just a sea of industry professionals. It was a collection of minds that could make change happen. But it was the quiet, unexpected presence in the back of the room that gave her pause. Judge Daniel Graves, his face familiar from the courtroom, sat in the audience. His presence was striking in this setting. Out of place, almost, but there he was, listening intently, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Nia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't sure if it was a coincidence or if he had come to see her, but there he was. Nia continued, more passionate than ever, using the platform to advocate for systemic change. As the presentation came to an end, the applause was thunderous, and the energy in the room was palpable. Nia felt proud, knowing that ConnectAll was no longer just an idea. It was a movement. Later that evening, during a networking session, Judge Graves approached her. His expression was different now, softer, less dismissive than the last time they had met. He extended his hand. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, his voice sincere, "I need to apologize. I didn't fully understand the scale of what you were trying to do. Your work is important, and I've realized how wrong I was to dismiss you so easily. I'd like to support your project. I'm here to learn how I can help." Nia blinked, taken aback. This wasn't the man she remembered from the courtroom. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady. "It's about time we all start understanding each other's work and how we can help make this country a more connected place for everyone." Judge Graves nodded, a hint of regret in his eyes. "I'll do whatever I can to assist you." Nia smiled, sensing a new chapter beginning, not just for ConnectAll, but for herself, and for a system that was finally starting to see her vision. In the weeks that followed the tech conference, Nia's life took on a new rhythm. ConnectAll had become more than just a project. It had morphed into a nationwide movement. Invitations to speak at policy forums, meetings with lawmakers, and interviews with news outlets poured in. Naya found herself constantly traveling, balancing her time between presentations, strategy sessions, and late-night work with her team. The shift in momentum felt surreal. A year ago, her initiative had been a small-scale pilot project, struggling to gain traction in a market dominated by big tech companies and entrenched bureaucratic systems. Now, it seemed like everyone was paying attention. But with the newfound recognition came an escalating pressure. There were still hurdles to overcome: funding, partnerships, and most importantly, gaining enough political support to make ConnectAll a nationwide reality. Naya's vision was expansive, but the challenge was how to move forward when the systems they were working to improve were still archaic and resistant to change. One afternoon, Naya sat in a conference room with Representative Lisa Grant and a team of tech policy experts, discussing potential legislation that would support universal digital access. The room buzzed with conversation, the air thick with urgency. "We need to convince the lawmakers that this isn't just a nice-to-have," Naya said, her voice firm. "This is about bridging a divide that has existed for far too long. It's about economic opportunity, education, healthcare, everything that hinges on having reliable access to the internet. If we can't make that case, then we'll never get the kind of funding we need." Grant nodded. "I agree. The challenge is proving that these communities are worth the investment. We have to show that digital inclusion isn't just a cost, it's a solution." Naya knew she was fighting not only for policy change, but for a broader cultural shift. People still viewed high-speed internet as a luxury, something that could be put off until it was convenient, rather than a fundamental part of modern life. Later that evening, Naya met with a group of tech industry leaders who were also on board with ConnectAll. Some were excited by the potential of the project, but others were hesitant. They questioned the financial viability of a nationwide program, arguing that it would take years to see returns. Naya listened patiently, but she wasn't deterred. "This isn't about waiting for a quick return on investment," she said, her eyes blazing with passion. "This is about long-term change. This is about creating a digital infrastructure that empowers the future. If we want to solve the problems of tomorrow, we need to invest in the people who will lead us there. If we can't make that happen, we're only setting ourselves up for failure." As the discussions continued, Naya realized that this project wasn't just a tech initiative. It was a testament to her belief in the power of access and opportunity. It wasn't enough to simply have a product or a plan. It had to be a movement that made people see the world differently. ConnectAll was quickly becoming that movement. The momentum was real, but Naya knew the fight was far from over. With every success, the stakes grew higher. And yet, with every new challenge, she felt more ready. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, she could see the destination clearly: a fully connected America. Despite the growing momentum, the path forward was not without its complications. The weeks following Naya's successful push for broader support for ConnectAll were marked by one hurdle after another. What had started as an exhilarating wave of national attention began to hit the inevitable walls of bureaucracy. Policy changes in Washington, even for initiatives as critical as digital equity, required more time and patience than Naya had expected. One day, Naya sat at her desk, staring at an email she had just received. It was a setback from a major tech partner that had been ready to fund a crucial pilot project in 3 rural communities. The email was polite but firm, stating that due to unforeseen financial pressures, they would be postponing their involvement in ConnectAll indefinitely. Naya stared at the screen, her frustration building. This wasn't just a missed opportunity. It was a blow to the people who had been waiting for months to benefit from the program. People in those rural communities had already been promised access to affordable internet, and now that promise seemed in jeopardy. She leaned back in her chair and exhaled deeply. This is the test, she thought. This was the moment that would define whether ConnectAll was a fleeting idea or a movement that could actually change lives. She quickly dialed Alicia, her communications director, who had been at her side since the beginning. "Alicia, we need to regroup. We just lost a major partner, and if we don't act fast, this will set us back months." Alicia's voice crackled through the phone. "I know, Nia, but we can't let this stop us. What's the backup plan? Do we have other investors on the table?" Nia thought for a moment before replying. "We do, but we need to shift our focus. If we want this to work, we have to make ConnectToll bigger than just internet access. We have to make it about jobs, about economic growth in these communities. We need to show the world that this isn't just about tech. It's about revitalizing entire regions." Alicia paused, then responded, "That's the message we've been missing. Maybe it's time we take a different angle." That night, Nia and her team worked late into the evening. They revamped their pitch, focusing on the broader economic impact that ConnectToll could bring to underserved communities: increased access to jobs, educational opportunities, healthcare resources, and, most importantly, economic revitalization. It was no longer just a tech initiative. It was a community-building initiative. The next morning, they reached out to new potential partners, local governments, foundations, and new tech companies that had yet to be involved. Nia knew this wasn't going to be easy, but she was more determined than ever. The setback had stung, but it also sparked a new approach, one that would elevate ConnectToll to a level that could change not just how people accessed the internet, but how they lived and worked in their communities. It was a moment of reinvention, and Nia was ready. In the weeks that followed, Nia's reinvigorated strategy began to pay off. The focus on economic empowerment through ConnectToll resonated deeply with new potential partners. Local governments, nonprofits, and even some smaller tech companies saw the value in not only providing internet access, but also driving job creation, educational opportunities, and economic growth in rural and underserved areas. One key partnership came from a major telecommunications company, TechLink, which had initially been hesitant to invest. After Nia's revised pitch, they saw the broader implications of the project and agreed to fund the initial stages of ConnectToll in exchange for helping them fulfill federal broadband expansion requirements. It was a major win, but Nia knew the real work had only just begun. With new funding in place, ConnectToll began its first pilot project in 3 rural communities in the Midwest, where internet access had long been a challenge. The team worked tirelessly to build the infrastructure, set up affordable broadband connections, and ensure that locals were properly trained to use the new tools at their disposal. Nia visited each site personally, meeting with community leaders, school administrators, and local business owners. Their gratitude was palpable, but so was the pressure to make the project a success. The eyes of the nation were now watching. It wasn't long before the project's impact became visible. Local businesses that had struggled with minimal or no internet access were suddenly able to offer remote jobs, attract customers from outside their immediate areas, and improve their marketing efforts. Schools were able to transition to hybrid learning models, allowing students who had been cut off from the digital world to access online resources. Healthcare providers could now offer telemedicine to those who had never before been able to travel long distances for in-person visits. It was clear that ConnectToll wasn't just a project, it was changing lives. Then, just as the pilot was gaining traction, a piece of news arrived that sent a ripple through the media and political circles. Nia was invited to testify before a congressional hearing on the state of digital inclusion in America. The invitation came directly from Representative Lisa Grant, who had become one of ConnectToll's strongest allies. This wasn't just any hearing. It was a chance to address lawmakers directly, present the real-world success stories from the pilot, and advocate for long-term federal support for internet expansion efforts. The stakes were higher than ever, and Nia knew this could be the turning point that would propel ConnectToll from a successful pilot to a nationwide movement. The room was packed with politicians, tech industry leaders, and advocates from across the country. As Nia stepped to the podium, her heart raced. She had come a long way from the courtroom, from the days when she had been dismissed and fined over technicalities. But now, she was standing on the precipice of something much bigger. This was her moment to truly change the narrative, not just for ConnectToll, but for the entire nation. As she began to speak, she felt the weight of the room and the future on her shoulders. It was time to take the next step. The room in the congressional hearing was silent as Nia stood at the podium, her eyes scanning the faces before her. There were seasoned lawmakers, a few skeptics, and a handful of eager advocates. Behind her, a large screen displayed images of the communities where CourageToRise had already made a transformative impact. Nia took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on her, but her voice was steady when she began. "Thank you, Chairwoman Grant, and thank you to all the members of this committee for giving me the chance to speak today. We are at a crossroads in America. While much of the country has experienced the digital revolution, millions remain disconnected, left out of the conversations, opportunities, and advancements that shape the future of our world." Nia paused, letting her words sink in. She knew the room was listening, and now was her chance to paint a clear picture of what was at stake. CourageToRise is not just a broadband expansion project, Nia continued. It is a movement to level the playing field. It's about creating access to jobs, education, healthcare, and opportunity for every American, regardless of where they live, how much they earn, or whether they have a disability. As she spoke, Nia felt the stories from the pilot programs rise within her. The small-town business owners who were now thriving thanks to e-commerce, the rural high school students who could now attend virtual classes, the elderly patients who had received life-saving consultations via telemedicine. This isn't just about technology. It's about equity, Nia said, her voice rising with passion. The digital divide isn't just an inconvenience. It's a barrier to the American dream. And we have the power to change that. Her words echoed in the room, and for a moment, she could feel the energy shift. The committee members were no longer just listening. They were leaning in. Even the skeptics were quiet, considering what she had just said. When Nia finished her testimony, there was a long, expectant pause before the first questions came. But these questions were different from what she had expected. Instead of challenging her or doubting her vision, the committee members seemed genuinely intrigued. They asked how they could assist, how the government could offer more robust funding, and how the laws surrounding internet infrastructure could be updated to support CourageToRise's goals. Nia answered confidently, her earlier frustrations replaced by an unshakable certainty. This was the breakthrough she had hoped for. The hearing was broadcast nationwide, and within hours, social media was buzzing with support for CourageToRise. Politicians, tech companies, and advocacy groups all rallied behind her. What had started as a small-scale project was now on the cusp of being a nationwide policy. Later that night, as Nia sat at her desk, reflecting on the events of the day, she received a message from Judge Daniel Graves. It was brief, but the words carried weight. "You were right. I see it now. Let's make this happen." Nia smiled, knowing that the journey was far from over. But this was the moment she had been working toward all along. CourageToRise was no longer just her dream. It was the country's future. A revolution in digital equity had begun, and Nia was leading the charge.